Well, hello, I'm Stephanie Priester, representing the Jazzy Report on behalf of the South Carolina Women in Leadership. I'm excited to introduce to some of you today a very amazing speaker that will talk about redistricting and gerrymandering. Lawson Wetli is a longtime Greenvillian and attorney with a practice area focus on corporate, transactional, and securities law. She received her JD from the Columbia University School of Law and worked at the Gibson Dunn in New York City before moving to Greenville and practicing with the Weiss Law Firm for a number of years. She currently practices with the Entrepreneurs Law Group. As a volunteer, Lawson is committed to helping people connect to their own power as voters and as a member of our civic body. Among Lawson's current volunteer roles are serving as president of the League of Women Voters of Greenville County, as a voter registration chair of the Greenville branch NAACP, and as a member of the board of the Greenville County Redevelopment Authority and the Upstate Mediation Center. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Lawson Wetli.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm really happy to be able to represent the League of Women Voters today in this South Carolina Women in Leadership presentation to talk about redistricting reform. And I don't know if y'all actually are confused about redistricting, but the thing that I hope to convey is that in its most basics, it's not that complicated. The problem is obvious, and what we can do about it is clear too. So that's what I hope you take away from this. I find it helpful when we start thinking about redistricting first to ask ourselves, what is the point of political districts? Because redistricting is just redrawing those district lines. And I find it helpful to think about what if we did not have political districts at all? Imagine the United States with no lines in there. And what would happen in elections is the majority would always defeat the minority. That's what would always happen. And of course, that would mean that to the extent people vote along racial or ethnic lines, the minority would always get completely shut out. And it also means that other kinds of majority minorities would shut each other out. So for example, in the United States, our population is about 80% urban and 20% other, rural voters. So if you vote just across the board, rural voters never get representation. Here in South Carolina, you can see that we have regional differences. So I live in the upstate, and international manufacturing is really important here. But if you get down more to the coast, you'll see that, for example, tourism might be more important. So we want political districts because political districts help us as communities have our voices be heard and have the opportunity to elect the representatives who will best represent us. Now, what is redistricting? It's the redrawing of those district lines, which happens every 10 years. Those lines determine who votes where. The voters decide who represents them. And those representatives make the laws that affect all of us. And I want to highlight, this is how it's supposed to work. It's important that the power goes from voters to the representatives, because then they need our votes and they need to listen to us. And the key problem right now is that that chain has been reversed. Because of problems with redistricting, a lot of times politicians are choosing their voters instead of voters choosing their representatives. Also, where does the redistricting happen? It's in closed rooms. Here in South Carolina and elsewhere, it is happening in closed rooms. Nothing good happens in the dark, is my personal opinion. And so another problem that relates to redistricting is it's really important to throw those doors open and have transparency about the process. We as voters need to be paying attention to how those decisions about redistricting are being made, because sunlight is the best disinfectant. Why do we have legislative districts? I mentioned reasons why it's a good idea to have legislative districts to help facilitate our power as voters. Also, the U.S. Constitution requires it. We are required at the federal, other than the Senate, state, and county level to have districts that are based on population size with equal population in each district. This is an example of two South Carolina U.S. House districts. They have different geographic sizes, different shapes, but they're based on the same population. Here's an example from the South Carolina House, our state legislature. Similarly, 2 different shapes, 2 different sizes, but the same population. That's how the districts need to work. And this is all to further the concept of one person, one vote. That's our basic of democracy. Why do we draw the lines every 10 years? We have to, because people move. People are born, people die. Unless you readjust the lines, you don't reflect those changes. That's why we have the census every 10 years. And it's on the basis of that census, current one happening in 2020, that we draw the new lines that give us equal size districts again. So census is in 2020, the next redistricting is going to be in 2021. So game on, redistricting, 2021. One element other than the U.S. Constitution that's important here is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which required that when you're drawing district lines, you have to take race and ethnicity into consideration with a view to making sure people have a real voice and a real opportunity for representation. And I do want to highlight this kind of redistricting consideration, so creating majority-minority districts, not only is this not part of the problem, this is a good and important thing. Again, you want people to have the opportunity to get real representation in their politicians. The kind of gerrymandering that is a problem is the kind that is trying to help or hurt a party or a candidate. So that's the problem we want to focus on. Who redraws the lines? In South Carolina, like in a lot of places, it's our very own state legislature. The fox is in the hen house. The exact people who have the most to gain or lose from how the district lines get drawn are the people with the power to draw those lines. Now, I want to emphasize, this is not about good guys and bad guys. This is about conflict of interest, because voters and politicians do not have the same interest here. It's in politicians' voters to get themselves reelected. It's in voters' interest to have real choices and real competition. And we at the League of Women Voters are always going to be team voter. Gerrymandering has been around just about as long as our nation has been around. The name actually comes from Elbridge Gerry, who created some monstrous-looking districts in 1812, which kind of sort of looked like a salamander. So, gerrymander, gerrymander. And it makes sense that it's been around for a long time, because whenever there is power, there's going to be temptation to abuse that power to help yourself, right, or your own party. And so this is not a partisan issue. Every party, every politician is going to be tempted to put a thumb on the scale to try to help themselves and hurt the other parties or the other candidates. It's just human nature. And again, we as voters have the incentive to make sure that we have a tamper-proof scale. That's what we want, a fair scale, fair rules, so that people can't put their thumb on the scale and our voice matters. When it comes to partisan gerrymandering, which is trying to help or hurt a political party, the way that you achieve that is, in essence, by trying to make people waste their votes. And if you think about it, there's 2 ways that your vote can get wasted. One of them is, if you vote for a losing candidate, your vote's wasted. It doesn't do anything. Another thing is, even if you vote for a winning candidate, if they didn't win, if they didn't need your vote because they were already going to win, that vote is wasted too. So every vote for a losing candidate is wasted. Every vote above a majority that a candidate needs to win is wasted. With that in mind, here are 2 of the key ways that you do partisan gerrymandering. It's called cracking and packing. Now, in these slides, what you'll see, you have a population that is 40% team red and 60% team blue. So that's the population. And what you'd hope in terms of ideal representation is that they elect 40% red candidates, 60% blue candidates. It reflects the population overall. One thing that you can do if you want to get your partisan gerrymander on is you can crack or split the other team's voters in a way that they're always going to waste their votes because they're going to lose. So in this middle example, what you can see is that Team Blue is in charge, and they have created 5 different districts in which Team Red always loses, right? All of the Team Red votes are always wasted. So even though that population of Team Red is 40%, they end up with 0% of the representatives. So this is cracking, splitting people up so that their votes essentially don't matter because they're going to lose. Packing is putting so many voters into one district that a lot of their votes get wasted because you didn't need that many votes to win. And what you see on this right-hand side is both packing and cracking. So these 2 districts over here have Team Blue voters packed into 2 districts. They're going to win those, but by huge margins. And all of the other blue voters are then cracked into these 3 districts. So in this instance, even though Team Red is 40% of the population, or rather Team Blue, yes, Team Red is 40% of the population, they end up with 60% of the representatives, 3-2. So you have a minority party getting majority representation. And the problem with partisan gerrymandering at its most basic is when you combine cracking and packing with powerful computer algorithms, it can result in a real distortion of democracy. Using an example of our sister state, North Carolina, up through the 2018 elections, they were using maps where the North Carolina population itself is about evenly split between the 2 major parties. It's about 50-50. They have 13 U.S. House districts. One party, the party in charge of drawing the map lines last time around, allocated themselves 10 out of the 13 seats. So even though the population is 50-50, one side got 10 representatives, the other side got 3. By the way, one of the architects of that gerrymander was asked, why'd you do it 10-3? And the answer was, I couldn't figure out a way to make it be 11-2. So this is fundamentally against our representative democracy. And that is partisan gerrymandering. Another kind of gerrymandering, and one that we think is a real problem here in South Carolina, is incumbent protective gerrymandering. It's the politicians who are in office drawing the lines to protect themselves and make it as easy as possible to get reelected. In this example, which has actually happened, you can have an up-and-coming challenger who lives in a politician's district, and that politician draws the lines to keep them out of the district so they don't have to run against them. And this is such a clear example of conflict of interest. Of course it's in that politician's interest not to have that competition, but of course it's in the voters' interest precisely to have that competition. You want choices. You want people caring about your vote. So in this system, exactly the people who are in charge of drawing the lines are also the people who have the most incentive to draw the lines to favor themselves and their own party. And one thing this means is that you end up with safe seats where people are so likely to just roll out of bed and get reelected that they don't draw competition at all, especially from the opposing party. This map shows in which districts in South Carolina in 2016 there even was a general election challenger. As you can see, most didn't. So very few South Carolina legislative districts are really competitive, not just because they don't get a challenger, but also because mostly even if they do, they're blowout elections. They're won by more than 10% of the vote. One thing this means is that a lot of times the real choice that we have as voters is in the primary. If someone draws a challenger, it's from their own party. And as we know, and unfortunately, primaries tend to have relatively low voter turnout. So in 2016, because there were so few general election challengers, and when there were challengers, it was often in the primary, which is low turnout, only 9% of South Carolina's voters elected over half of our state legislature. Think about that. 9% of us are electing over half of the people representing us. That's not the way it's supposed to work. We also think that this kind of gerrymandering leads to the hyperpolarization that we see today. And this has a whole bunch of problems associated with it. For one thing, if you're in a hyperpolarized district and you're not part of the majority party, your representative has absolutely zero incentive to listen to what you have to say. Also, if people don't have to listen to all of the voters, which tends to make the politicians appeal to the more extreme voters among us, how are they going to govern when they win? If you have representatives representing the extremes of our society, and then they all come together in the legislature, how are they going to get anything done? What happens when we give legislators power to do the districts? Well, unless we're paying attention, they're going to draw the lines to help themselves. In other states, there have been some fixes to create independent commissions or to do things differently. Also, in many cases, those states have options that we don't have in South Carolina, like the ability of citizens to put a ballot initiative on the ballot. For us in South Carolina, pretty much all roads go through our state legislature, so that's where we need to focus our efforts. There have been lawsuits to try to get courts to step in and stop gerrymandering. We had very much hoped that the federal courts would step in and help, but as of 2019, they declined to do so. So the federal courts are not going to help us. We have to help ourselves. And again, in South Carolina, it means it's up to us to work with our state legislature to try to make redistricting reform happen. So, the League of Women Voters is trying to achieve people-powered fair maps. What does that mean? Well, in the short run, we'd really like to pass redistricting reform legislation in our state legislature, which again is the arena with the power to make this happen. And we do want them to pass the legislation that gives voters a meaningful choice in the election booth. We want district lines not to be drawn to help or hurt a political party or an incumbent. And we want an independent commission to be the people in power to make those decisions. Also, looking towards 2021, looking towards next year when the redistricting is happening, we think it is crucially important that the map drawing process be open and transparent, that people be paying attention, that would be us, and making sure that the process is happening in a fair way that's likely to keep us in the driver's seat as voters. If you want to do something about this, and I certainly hope you do, one of the most important things you can do is contact your state legislators and make sure that they know you want them to support redistricting reform. You can keep it general. I'd like you to support redistricting reform. You can get specific. I'd like you to support House Bill 3054. But this is going to happen if our legislators know that we care, that we're paying attention, and that we want them to do something. So that's one of the most important steps that you can take. And 2021 is coming. We hope that you'll be helping safeguard the process when it does. Thank you so much for this opportunity.